I'm the last survivor of the Holocaust in our family.
Behind the words, pictures, and artifacts in the museum are people whose stories of survival and hope come alive to inspire new generations of upstanders. One by one, these stories stir the soul.
Can there really be hope for us?
Mine is 4018. My sister was 4017.
Holocaust survivors, their descendants, liberators, champions of justice, and courageous upstanders ask only this: hear my story, so that the lessons they teach will echo for generations.
I will never meet someone else like my father. But there are many of us who, if we come together, can keep his voice alive.
These stories will change you. They will move you to action, inspiring the best of humanity every day. I'm Jackie Congedo, and on this episode, we have Fred and Barb Miller, the son and daughter-in-law of Dr. Al Miller. Al was born in Germany, but at only 15 years old, as things got worse for German Jews, he left for Switzerland. When he and his family were able to immigrate to the United States years later, an American immigration officer showed him grace after Al realized he'd misplaced his immigration papers. With newfound gratitude and confidence, Al joined the U.S. Army and became a Ritchie boy, one of less than 2,000 German Jewish soldiers trained at Camp Ritchie and later sent to Germany to interrogate suspected Nazi war criminals. Prior to his death in 2023 at the age of 100, Al made it his daily mission to impart his story and the life lessons learned to make the world a better place. It's our honor to share his story here. Hosting the conversation is Holocaust and Humanities Center's Trinity Johnson, who is also a longtime friend of the Miller family.
We look at the Statue of Liberty. Is it real? Can there really be hope for us? By that time, I'd lived in 5 countries over a period of 3.5 years. That's how long it took to come to the United States. I'd lived in Switzerland, in Belgium, in Holland, and in England. In Germany, of course. And none of those countries was I welcome. Now here, the Statue of Liberty. How would our arrival be greeted in the United States? We weren't so sure. We were hoping, symbolized by the Statue of Liberty. Okay, so we arrive in New York, and the immigration officer establishes himself in one of the cabins. Everybody goes through that. Eventually our turn comes. This is the first real American that I had seen, ever. And I wonder if they all looked like that. He had, what did I say? What kind of a hat he had on?
Straw hat, right?
A straw hat, flat straw hat. Yeah, okay. And the shirt open down to hair, cigarette dangling in his mouth, feet on the desk. Very, very informal, very, very polite, very, very nice, and it turned out helpful. And we were not used to that from any official in any country in Europe, none whatsoever. They were all boom, boom, boom. This one? Okay. So he says, "May I have your papers, please?" My parents give him their papers and passports, whatever was needed. And he says everything is fine. And my brother's turn comes, and here it is. It's the papers and the passport. Everything is fine. My turn comes. My papers, please. I reach here, reach here, reach here, reach here. I don't have them. Who took them? Why are they? Where are they? Where could they possibly be? I tell you, panic sets in quickly and powerfully. If my mother's looks could kill, I wouldn't be here now. And my mother was good at that. So this official, of course, sees all this, and he talks to me and says, "Sonny, relax. In the excitement, you probably left all that in your cabin. Go to your cabin, you will find it, and bring it to me. In the meantime, I'll take care of your family." I run to the cabin. he was right. I found him under some other things, and I bring him to the official again. He says, here it is. And he signs what he needs to sign. I sign what I need to sign. We're ready to go. And he stops us, and he talks to me. And again, this is one of the things that I probably will not forget. I'm not so sure about that anymore, but I hope I will not forget. And this is what he says: Sonny, you are now in a free country. You are in the United States of America. Make something of yourself. Get an education. Obey our laws. And if you do all that, we will be grateful to you that you came to live with us. Let me tell you, by contrast with all these other officials that we had run across, this man is a miracle. He's not real. And so, I don't know what to say to him. And the time has come to leave, and we left. And did he say anything else? No.
No, but you talk about how that sentence made an impact on your life. How did that sentence impact you? That simple sentence.
How did it impact me? It made a huge difference. If they're all like that in the United States, what could go wrong?
Thank you both for being here with me today. Fred Miller, the son of Dr. Al Miller, and Barbara Miller, the daughter-in-law of Al Miller, to speak about this absolutely incredible human being's legacy and how he's impacted all of our lives so differently. As we saw in the video, that was a favorite moment of every time he told his story, one of my favorite moments. But before we really dive into that pivotal moment, Fred, I was hoping you could bring us up to speed kind of with the rest of Al's story briefly. Tell us where he was from, how his family got to America, and then tell us about his life in Cincinnati.
Okay. My father was born in Berlin in 1922. His parents were from Berlin. His grandparents were from Berlin. His family had a shirt factory that they had started in 1871. So it was 50 years in business or so by the time my father was born. My father grew up in Berlin as a child, went to school in Berlin, and of course the Nazis came to power in 1933. So my father was only 11 and went to school, and it became very difficult for him in school because his friends were Nazi youth, the teachers were Nazis. They made life very difficult for him. He ended up being the last Jewish kid in the school, and ultimately he was very stubborn, and he liked to play sports, and the school was big with sports, and he had some good friends who, even though they were not Jewish and even wore swastikas, they treated him well. So he stayed for as long as he could, but ultimately became too difficult, and he ended up leaving. And he went to boarding school in Switzerland. And then comes Crystal Night, November 9, 1938. His parents had to flee their apartment, and it was a very difficult time for them because they had no place to live. His father ended up went to the hospital in Berlin. He was not sick, he was not injured, there was no problems, but he went there to a Catholic hospital and said, I need surgery. He did not need surgery, but the people at the hospital knew that sentence or that phrase for code, which was shelter me. And at that time, the Nazis weren't rounding up people in hospitals, and so the hospital performed unnecessary surgery on my grandfather. They took out his appendix. And unlike today, where you go in for an appendix and you're in one minute and you're out the next, then it bought you 2 or 3 weeks. And then he had a second unnecessary surgery after that, I think something with his nose. and that bought him a few more weeks. Meanwhile, my grandmother was scrambling to get all the papers so they could leave Berlin, which she ended up being able to do, and my father met them at the train station in Belgium. That was December or so, 1938. Then ultimately they went to, settled in London, England. In London at that time, my parents were, or my grandparents were classified as enemy aliens because they were not English, obviously. They were not allowed to work. No adults were allowed to work because of the economy, and it was difficult for the English themselves to earn a living, much less having people come from other countries and take away the jobs from the English. Big loophole was that if you were under 18, you were allowed to work. And so my father ended up getting a job at Bausch & Lomb, grinding lenses. And ultimately that defined his career because he became an optometrist in later years. My grandmother took in sewing. She wasn't allowed to work, but she did this on the side and on the sly and took in sewing, and they managed to cobble together somewhat of a living for the family. They lived in London for a year and a half. My grandfather had a cousin, first cousin in New York, who had agreed to sponsor them because you couldn't just leave England and go to another country. It certainly couldn't go to the United States, which had a strict quota. Plus, you had to have a sponsor, meaning somebody who would be financially responsible for you because, again, you didn't want people coming into the country and then going on welfare or having to rely on the government for assistance for people who were not even Americans. So you had to have somebody who was financially responsible. And my grandfather's cousin agreed to do that, but it wasn't so simple, and that took quite a while to get all the paperwork together, get the approvals. The English government had told my grandparents and my father and his brother, they gave them a date certain. They said, if you don't have anything by such and such a date, you're going to be shipped off to the Isle of Man to sit out the rest of the war. The Isle of Man was a windswept, barren island in the Irish Sea where the refugees were housed. It was not a very pleasant place. By sheer luck, by sheer coincidence, by sheer miracle, the day that they were to be shipped out to the Isle of Man, the paperwork came from New York that the sponsorship came through, and my parents and my father and his brother and his parents were able to go to New York. So they sailed to New York. And actually, there's a funny story with the people that watched the ship come in, and everybody's milling around on the dock. And my grandfather was yelling to somebody. He needed to get hold of his cousin, who was an attorney in New York. And so he's yelling over to people, hey, does anybody know such and such? His name was Korn. Does anybody know this person? And somebody yelled up, I do, he's my lawyer. And so they were able to connect, and they were able to meet up with his cousin. My father's brother had been in the Masons, and he hooked up somebody, got a connection with somebody who was in Mount Vernon, Ohio, who was also in the Masons. And my uncle went to visit him and seemed to like what was going on in Ohio, and ended up getting a job in Cincinnati at the Mack Shirt Company. As I said, my father's family had a shirt factory in Berlin, and my uncle had been groomed to take over the operation. So he knew pretty much all aspects of everything, from the cutting the shirts and behind the scenes and the business. So he ended up getting the shirt at the Mack Shirt Company. He liked it in Cincinnati, and so he told my grandparents and my father, and they ended up joining him in Cincinnati. Later, my father went to optometric school in Northern College of Optometry in Illinois, in Chicago, became an optometrist, and then he also joined the United States Army. he was still a German citizen. He was not a United States and American citizen, so they had to hurry up. He couldn't be in the Army without being a citizen, so he had to hurry up, and usually it takes a long period of time to become a citizen, but they rushed it through so he could be in the Army. And then ultimately they were training him to be a medic. He was a staff sergeant. And one day part of his duties were to drive a Jeep and drive somebody of higher rank around, maybe a major. I don't know what the person's rank was, but somebody who he was not allowed to talk to and was only allowed to drive him around. My father knew that he had this talent knew German perfectly, of course, and knew the German mind and so on, but he didn't know, nobody had asked him about it, nobody had thought to make use of that. One day he was driving this major around, and the Jeep broke down for whatever reason. And my father, not very mechanical, and I've taken after him with that trait.
That was your brother.
And both of my brothers, and none of us are mechanical, but the major said, "Hey, soldier, you have to get this fixed." And so my father didn't know what to do. So he went to opened up the hood and tinkered around a little bit with stuff and just touching and pushing and pulling, and didn't know. So he puts the hood back down, gets back in the Jeep, turns the key, and thank God the Jeep started right up for reasons he has no idea, didn't know why. And the major said to him, "Good job, soldier." And my father, it was strictly forbidden, you do not talk to superior officers. But my father thought, well, now's an opening, maybe take a chance and say, Major, whatever, I'm German, or I come from Germany, and I have a knowledge of the German culture and so on. And of course, my father didn't know anything about the Ritchie boys at that time. He just said, maybe you might want to make use and take advantage of my knowledge and my abilities. And the major didn't say another word, and nothing happened. But then a few months later, my father got notice to report to Camp Ritchie, which is where he ended up learning counterespionage and map reading and interrogation techniques. And my father always liked to say, initially he was a medic and they taught him how to save people. Then they gave him a gun and they taught him how to kill people. And so he became a Ritchie boy, which was the secret camp in Fort Ritchie, Maryland, near Hagerstown, near the Pennsylvania border, where people were recruited who had knowledge of the Japanese, because the Japanese were also recruited for a similar version, but for the German culture and counterespionage, and recruited to go back to Germany and assist the American forces and the British forces to go over captured documents and secret codes and try to figure out what the Germans were up to from these documents, and try to explain to the Americans and the British in terms they could understand what they believed the German mentality was doing and what the Germans were up to. Now, my father didn't go back to Germany. He was sent back to Germany after the war in 1945, still a staff sergeant. And his job was to interrogate prisoners. And he always liked to say, 1 minute before the war ended, everybody was a Nazi. 1 minute after the war ended, nobody was a Nazi. But so it was his job to try to ferret out people they're telling him the truth, that they really had nothing to do with anything other than being recruited as a soldier, or were they more complicit in what was going on? And he had 15, 20 minutes to write a report, pass it on to his superiors with his recommendation that this person needs more interviews, or just let the person go as a regular prisoner of war. Yeah, it was interesting because he was a lowly staff sergeant, which is pretty low on the totem pole, but they gave him a uniform that had no insignia whatsoever. So you couldn't tell from his uniform what rank he was, because it would not be unusual for him to interrogate higher-ranking Nazis or higher-ranking German soldiers who, if they knew that he was a staff sergeant, they wouldn't bother to talk to him, even though they had been captured and were prisoners of war. So they didn't know that he was really a staff sergeant, and so that was one of the techniques that they used to get them to talk. Later, after he left the Army, he ended up meeting my mom. It was a blind date. They had met each other 5, 6, 7 times before they got married in 1951. It was a true match made in heaven, because they ended up being married close to 70 years before my mother passed away in 2020. They ended up moving to Hamilton, Ohio, where I wasn't born in Hamilton. I was born in Toledo, but my 2 brothers were born in Hamilton. I have a brother, Randy, and a brother, Ron, who we grew up in Hamilton, and it was a very nice childhood, very nice life that my parents had made for us in Hamilton. My father, who was the ultimate outsider coming from Germany, integrated, and my mom as well, too. I certainly don't want to, she was a very crucial part of it. They integrated themselves very well into Hamilton society. My father became a member of Greater Hamilton Civic Theater, which he was one of the founding members in the late 50s, to put on plays, and he acted in any number of plays and worked behind the scenes, as well as my mom for the theater. And my father was very active, and my mother, in the Hamilton Synagogue. At the time I was growing up, there were actually 2 synagogues in Hamilton, and now there's 1. And they were very active with that. And they raised the 3 boys, so me and my 2 brothers, and I've all become very successful, and they did just a marvelous job with us. Ultimately, and my father made the ultimate sacrifice as I see it. My mom, she was 95. They were still living on their own. They had moved away from Hamilton, but Mason, which wasn't far away. They were living on their own. They were both driving. They lived in a condo, and they were doing very well. But my mom had fallen and broken her hip, and she had to have an operation. Everybody was concerned that she had a weak heart. And everybody's concerned that the operation would kill her. It didn't, but she had to go into a nursing home for rehab, and this was in the height of COVID. This happened in October 2020. And my father, who was perfectly healthy, nothing wrong with him, went into rehab with my mother in a nursing home so that he could act as her eyes and ears and assist her with everything. Ultimately, my mother got COVID while she was in the nursing home, and she passed away in December 2020. My father got COVID as well, and he was deathly sick, and he had double pneumonia. Fortunately, he recovered, and he lived another 3.5 years or so, and he died a couple months shy of his 101st birthday in August 2020.
Such an amazing life, and both having known Janie and especially being as close as I was to Al, they're just both so missed, and such a big hole in all of our hearts to not be with them. But that's why I think something like our conversation today is so important, to keep that legacy alive and keep these lessons that they both taught us through their stories. So thank you for sharing that. And actually, I wanted to get back to that video, but now I have a separate question, because you mentioned Al marrying Janie, who was also a Holocaust survivor and whose family came here. And Barb, you married into this family. Can you share a little bit about what was it like meeting Al and Jane the first time, learning kind of this family's history, and how did that impact you over the years?
Well, first of all, it was wonderful to marry into this family. For me, it was just a very loving, warm family with all the right values. And from the get-go, I loved both of my in-laws. My father-in-law, what I remember, the very first time that Randy brought me to their home in Hamilton, he sat me down in the family room on the couch, and really I thought he was using his, now that I know, Ritchie boy tactics, because I was definitely being interrogated. Wanted to know everything you possibly could know. And but I got him. I understood him totally. Randy's mom also, phenomenal interviewer. She could have been a Barbara Walters, I think. You could sit with my mother-in-law and talk to her for hours and hours about everything. But in a totally different way, complete opposite demeanors, in my opinion. No, and then as through the years, as I certainly learned their stories, I honestly, and Fred, correct me if I'm wrong, but Randy always tells me this, it wasn't until I arrived on the scene that I was the one who started asking all the questions. So I think having 3 sons and, it was a fascinating experience for me to hear and learn about their remarkable lives. I knew both grandmothers. When I got married, both were alive. I also heard their stories and heard the versions they told me. And just this past year was able to return with Randy and Randy's younger brother, Ronnie. We actually went to Vienna and actually went into the apartment where my mother-in-law lived and saw the town where she spent her summers. So it's been a remarkable journey. And, I think their lives were so rich. They were so complete. I mean, that's a hard statement to say about most people. But they had a marriage that to this day, my daughter keeps looking for that marriage. It was a perfect marriage. And they balanced each other, and they were just incredible parents and grandparents.
I don't want to neglect my mother's story as well. I told my father's story. I'll just touch on my mom. She grew up in Vienna, Austria. And of course, it was very difficult. Life became very difficult in Vienna as well. So my mom and her brother and her parents had to escape, and they ended up going to Prague. And then from Prague, they ended up in Cleveland, Ohio, where they hated it. There was a family, another relative took them in, and that was very generous of them, but it was a large family, and they're taking in 4 more people, and so it was very crowded and very difficult for again, the outsiders. So they didn't last very long in Cleveland and ended up going back to New York. And then later my mom met my father, and then, like I said, they moved to Hamilton.
And it's amazing they both had different escape stories, right? Al and Jane, and found each other and married. I met Al through my work at the Holocaust and Humanities Center as a member of our Speakers Bureau, because he would share his story with one person, 10 people, 1,000. It didn't matter how big or how small that audience was. But Janie didn't share her story publicly. And I'm wondering, what do you think it was about Al that made it so important that he took on this mission of making sure we know about the Holocaust and about his experience?
Neither of my parents would not talk about it. They talked about it to us as children. As Barbara said, we were young and dumb and didn't really ask many questions, but it wasn't that my parents were trying to keep it from us, because they were not. I remember clearly a lot of the stories that my father told later, and as well as my mother. I was very young, and my mother told me the story in Vienna, how the Nazis had thrown dirt and whatever on the sidewalk and grounded up the Jews to make them clean it up with toothbrushes. And that included my mother's mother and my mother's brother, who was just a teenager at the time. And the Austrians would stand around and kick them and mock them and laugh at them and throw more dirt and just totally humiliate them. And my mother talked about that when I was young. My father also told many stories. I haven't mentioned any of them yet today, but there were many stories I heard growing up But he didn't formally give talks until much later in life, until after he had retired. He was an optometrist until I don't know how long he practiced, in 40-some years, I suppose. And it wasn't till the last 10 or 15 years that he became more and more vocal about speaking about his experiences in the Holocaust. I suppose, I know Werner Koppel, who was the first to bring it up. And my father had known Werner for many years. They met in Cincinnati years ago. They played soccer together, and they were colleagues. So maybe my father was inspired a little bit by what Werner was doing, and then it took on a life of its own. And he spoke well until not long before he passed away. He would speak 2 or 3 times a week, and it energized him, and it gave him life, and it gave him spirit, and he enjoyed very much, not the fact that to help himself physically and mentally, but he wanted to impart the message of what happened. And he always said, I don't care, or I think Barbara mentioned, I don't care if there's 100 people in the audience, I don't care if there's 1 person in the audience. If what I say can make an impact, then I'm happy that I've done my job.
Yes, and to that point, I met Al when he was kind of at the height of his storytelling, in that 2 and 3 times a week, and even that wasn't enough. He would call me and want more and more speaking engagements, and he had such an impact on everyone who heard from him. What do you think it was about Al or his story that speaks to people so deeply?
Well, I also think it was the timing as well. And I think when Al did start speaking, we were living in remarkable times. I think much of what he experienced and his message resonates with many things that are happening today. So I think that was highly impactful. I also think that Al had a way of framing things. I mean, there are certain things we can all remember, certain phrases that I just, and everyone else hung on to. The Holocaust didn't start with bullets, it started with words. And I mean, how absolutely true that is about most ways war starts. I would argue that, he is, do not do to others what you don't want done to you. I mean, there are certain things, certainly his telling of what the immigration officer said to him when he arrived. They don't leave you. He had his words were well thought and hit right to the heart too. And I would say that the two of them didn't know a stranger. So once you met him, you were invited to their house, you were having them for dinner, they were having you for dinner. I mean, it was amazing to me in the last 10, 15 years, how many new friends they made, many of which came through Al's speaking engagements as well. And that too was something that I believe was such a blessing for them as well, that the Holocaust Center actually offered Al and Jane this incredible, I think, and last chapter to look back at your life and to be able to share it with so many people. So I think that was really beautiful for them. I really do.
And I, knowing Al and also Janie as well as I did, I think you're completely right. They immediately made you feel like part of the family. You both do as well. I mean, the warmth that comes from the Miller clan is incredible and has always made me feel like a part of the family.
You were a granddaughter.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Stephanie regards you as a cousin.
I have a funny story about my mother not knowing a stranger. I went to college in New Orleans, and she came down to visit me in my senior year in 1975, and she flew by herself. And I didn't have a car, so she was going to have to take a taxi from the airport, which was 30, 40 minutes away. And all of a sudden, there she was, but she didn't come in a taxi. She came in a private car. I said, "How did you get here?" She said, "Oh, I made friends with the flight attendant, and she brought me from the airport to..." That was the essence of my mother.
Yeah, true. Very true.
Not surprising at all. They were both just absolute gems. You mentioned the immigration story, which again, I think was always a part of Al's story, as serious as he was. I mean, in their really scary escape, their daring escape. But that provided a moment of brevity, right? In his talk, when he was talking about kind of the informal nature of this first American, and his feeling of relief and feeling freedom upon arriving, but then this small act of kindness, or the showing of kindness, that was the first time someone had shown him that. And he talks about how much that changed his whole outlook, that simple moment of kindness. And I'm wondering if either of you can share how you saw that play out in his life.
You know, it's interesting because I didn't grow up with Al and Jane as my parents. But when I initially met Al, and I would have described him as an introvert, and particularly compared to my mother-in-law, who was not at all. But he loved the stage, and he loved to act.
He loved the stage.
And the minute you gave him the stage, he was completely different. So it's an interesting, he was very well-read. I think if you gave him a choice of going to a party or reading a book, he'd probably prefer reading a book, where she wouldn't. I mean, she liked to read, but she would have been out there in every social thing. So it's different, but again, his ability to speak publicly and to command an audience was incredible. Yeah.
The theater, the singing, even a poet, right? Poetry.
Starting with, I don't want to steal your thunder, but starting with my brother and Barbara's wedding, my father wrote he had always written poems, and his father had written poems, so that was not unusual. But he started a family tradition with their wedding, with the Mazel Tov song from Fiddler on the Roof, a blessing on your head, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov, where he wrote a whole series of rhymes and poems set to that song, and had everybody in the audience singing along with the refrain. And it started with their wedding, but then it morphed into every family event. He would write a song to that tune, and everybody would join in. And now we have carried on that tradition. My brother Ron had a surprise 65th birthday party in Dallas in November. And Barbara and my wife and Randy and me went down to surprise my brother. We performed that song we prepared it and performed that song for him too, just to carry on that family tradition that my father had started.
And I don't know if it was the first time, but for Al's 100th birthday, I know the family performed that song for him. I'm not sure if that was the first time.
My daughter Lauren wrote that for my father's 100th birthday.
That was a special moment.
What is also quite remarkable, again, to the way this family, to me, a very idyllic family. Every birthday they ever had, each son, and I have them, got poems. Every single birthday, Al wrote a poem to them, whether they were 7 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old, 10, and on it went. They're beautiful, and they're so heartfelt. And the other thing that, after Al passed away, he saved everything, and was a shoebox filled of single-space typewritten letters, love letters to Jane. Just beautiful. So he expressed himself so beautifully with words, with poetry. I believe his father wrote poems, but I also believe Al's mother's father was an author and a writer, and he too. So somehow this, putting things down with the pen was really important to him. Yeah.
Which is so interesting, because the way he shared that immigration story in that moment where he had been such an introvert, and that basically gave him the permission to be a strong, independent person. because that's the person I knew. I knew the extrovert Al. I knew the theatrical, poised and spoken performer, really. And
I also think of the time he told the story of when he got caught in the school that he loved so much wearing the swastika pin, and this teacher sees him, all the other kids were wearing it, so he put it on and forgot it was on, and the teacher sees him and just says words to him that he never heard, and just basically said to him, if you want to go to a concentration camp, I'll be happy to get you there. And how that destroyed him. He often talked about that, and in comparison to the immigration officer who uplifted him. Yeah. So again, his point of words do matter.
Words matter.
And I think of that often to be a 12-year-old boy, or however old he was at that time, and to have a teacher say such horrific things to you. I mean, and to know that you have to hide yourself when you're walking through the streets of Berlin. I mean, I can't imagine how that plays on your psyche as a child.
He always said he had been, before coming to America, he had always been introverted and quiet and shy and didn't want to speak up. And this one sentence from this immigration officer changed his entire outlook.
Right.
And lifted him up, as Barbara said, and made him proud, and made him not necessarily extroverted, but told him that he didn't have to be so shy and introverted. He was somebody, and he did make something of himself. And a lot of it is thanks to this unknown, unnamed immigration officer.
I think it's interesting that he could have stayed silent. He could have chosen never to share a story. You shared that one of his friends locally, Warner Koppel, was sharing his story and his experiences during the Holocaust. What do you think was kind of his turning point? Because my understanding is there were many years he didn't share his story. And at some point he did start sharing his story more. And you alluded to maybe it was retirement, but I also can't imagine a time ever where Al wasn't willing to share this story. And I'm wondering what you think changed that in him.
I can't answer that. I know he became more and more involved with the Holocaust Museum. And the former director, Sarah Weiss, became very close to him and certainly helped move him in that direction.
I also think that you're in Hamilton, Ohio. And I think there was a desire to be as like everybody else. He was trying to establish a good career as an optometrist. He was active in the civic, things throughout the city. He was active in a synagogue. I think I could see where this would not be a priority at that point in life. And I also think we didn't have a Holocaust Center. I really do believe that the Holocaust Center here gave Al this platform. I mean, as I said earlier, I just think this was what a wonderful opportunity this provided him in his
at that time,
life.
There was no mechanism for nobody to set up a schedule and plan and set anything up. There was
Nor
no
was
such
it that
thing.
talked about that much.
It wasn't talked about that much, but there was no formal or even informal way of organizing these speeches till they started developing through the Holocaust Center.
I agree.
Well, and I was honored to be his manager, as he would call me, to schedule him. But I never scheduled him enough. And I think it's interesting because his story has impacted us in so many different ways. Barb, you're a docent. Fred, you're also a museum docent and lead tours. And Fred, you've actually started sharing Al's story in kind of a Speakers Bureau format like Al used to. And I'm just wondering, what is that mission inside of each of you? What is that like to carry on his words, his lessons for audiences today?
A couple months ago, Barbara's son, Jeremy, is a teacher in Oak Hills. My father used to go every year to talk to Jeremy's class, sixth graders. And my father obviously isn't doing it anymore, and Jeremy asked me if I would go, and I went a couple months ago and talked. There must have been 200 sixth graders. And I thought, well, they're going to fidget, and they're going to play with their phones, and they're going to poke the next person next to them, or whatever. Not whatsoever. They all sat in attention and listened, and they were very interested in what I had to say, and they asked good questions. But the touching moment to me was afterwards, and I was standing around talking to Jeremy before I left. One of the girls in the class came up to me and said, "Mr. Miller, do I have your consent to give you a hug?" And of course, I did hug her, and she hugged me, and that was very touching, and that made everything worthwhile. And I got through to her, and who knows how many other people I got through to. So that really says it all to me.
What about you?
Well, first of all, I think the work of the Holocaust Center is so critical, and I think all generations should, particularly as the Holocaust survivors are not with us anymore, need to be speaking out right now and sharing their stories as best they can. I think that when I talk to students, it is remarkable how insightful they are, the questions they ask. They can identify with a young child who might be at school and who, is a soccer player and who is living a wonderful life, and perhaps things turn upside down, or even if they think about being bullied or things of that nature. And I think it's great to see their wheels start spinning. So I think it's important. These are remarkable human beings who went through a lot, and I think their stories can't be forgotten. And I think, again, I will go to the times we are living now. It is more than, in my lifetime, I can't think of a more important time to be sharing these stories.
Well, and thank you both for the work you are doing and raising awareness of anti-Semitism and hatred, and keeping Al's story alive and keeping this legacy and these lessons in the forefront for students, community members, book clubs, you name it, because you both also have, I see and hear that willingness to share with anyone, and that really is just amazing for me to see and get to work with both of you. At the center, as you both know, we talk a lot about character strengths, these 24 innate strengths that we all have that at any moment we can use to affect change, and we hope that we're inspiring each individual to use those strengths to make a positive impact on the community. If you had to strength spot Al, what do you think his strengths were? I mean, we all have all 24. He definitely had all 24. What do you think his top strengths were as a person?
Integrity. I really do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Humility. I think it was Ronnie, Fred's youngest brother, who told me that Al had put, I wish, maybe you know it, a sticker on Ronnie's bedroom door that was all about don't ever think you're too great at anything.
I don't remember
Yeah,
that.
Ronnie talks about this. I think, honestly, he had all 24. If you ask me, it would be hard not to argue that. But top on the list is integrity.
He was very humble.
And
for
humble.
all
He
his
was so
accolades
humble.
and all
Yeah.
his extroverted talking and on the stage, he didn't want to fuss. He didn't care about awards. He didn't care about a fuss or being interviewed or on TV. Just let me tell my story and let me go home and read a book.
Yes, and I definitely think love of learning. Because I remember his library at both homes and just filled with books, which is actually a really good segue to something that recently happened. your family donated the rest of Al's personal documents and photographs and artifacts that we're so very grateful that you entrusted the center and our archives, to preserve and keep those safe and be able to exhibit and use for research and an educational purpose. And I'm just wondering if in the process of going through, because as you said, he kept everything, which is true, based on the boxes I saw come in. Were there any new learnings, both for Al or even Jane's experiences, but then also just pieces of him that you maybe weren't aware of until you really saw the wealth of the things he kept?
Well, Barbara was telling me on the ride here today.
Yeah. I think one of the most fascinating letters I found. So here, all these years, we've heard the story of how Al's parents escaped from Berlin and went into the hospital, as Fred said, and were able to meet Mrs. So-and-so on the street, and regards from Herbert, and get the documents needed to get out and to go to Belgium and then Holland and then England. I found a letter written by Al's father, written while he is in Amsterdam temporarily, to, I believe it may be Mr. Korn in America, explaining to him everything he went through while in Berlin, including going to the hospital, how the doctor clearly understood their predicament without having to say too much, and then basically how his wife, Grandma Missa, managed to get them out and meet people on the street. So that to me was, this sounds crazy, but it was like, oh my God, this is the first-hand experience. This is him telling it. Al was second generation experience, if you will, from that particular story. This was his father's story. And then, as I shared with you, years ago, I had interviewed Grandma Missa, Al's mother, and I forgot about that. And it was typewritten, page after page after page, and she's telling the story. And she's the one who had to go underground and meet all these people to get these basically forged documents so that they could get out, and who she had to meet with. And again, it was fascinating to me. There's Al's story, who's the child. There's the father's story, who experienced it, and his wife's story, who experienced the mother. So of all the things that I found related to this specific story, that was the most incredible. But then, to your point too, were all these documents that show how many generations back the Jews were living in Germany, all the way back to a document that indicates Napoleon gave them citizenship. These are generations. And how did this happen? How did this happen? And the only other thing that always makes me, it's hard to understand, Al had photographs of his grandfather's apartment. This apartment is a palace. Huge oil paintings, chandeliers, massive grand pianos, beautiful furniture. What happened to all that? What did they leave behind, and what did Germany lose? I mean, so seeing this, I don't know how many survivors have these kinds of things. We can't figure out how they got them.
How did you get all these documents out, furniture out, china out, silverware out, one thing after another? We stocked furnished homes, yet they left with nothing. So I never did get a good...
Can you touch on that a little bit more? Because as you said, they owned a successful shirt factory. The apartment was exquisite.
Well, the factory,
Al always shares how much they arrived to America carrying.
The factory was taken over by the Nazis. And I don't know how many people it employed, 50, 70 people. 500? Okay. Yeah. The Nazis made my grandfather pay their salary, even though there was no longer any factory. And I don't know how long that had to go on for, but it broke them. Because who can afford that when there's no income? What was your question?
And then they arrived to America with
Two
They came-
suitcases.
My grandparents, they each brought one suitcase, and my father always told the story of what it was like at the train station getting into Belgium, the last stop in Germany. Here come two Nazi soldiers onto the train, and they grabbed my grandparents' suitcases, and they weren't allowed to take any valuables, no good clothing, no nothing.
$5.
And they
Comparable.
didn't. But the Nazis, the SS, didn't know and make sure that nothing was hidden, which there was nothing hidden. And actually, then they took my grandparents, took my grandmother in one direction, my grandfather in one direction, and they searched them thoroughly to make sure that they were not hiding anything on their bodies. And my father always said to my grandfather, no big deal, he was in the army, he's used to that, who cares? My grandmother, very private person, talked about humiliation. That was very difficult for her. And she never talked about that to me. I only know about it through my father. But they each had $5 in their pocket. They had clothing that was strewn. They got the Nazis to finally let them go at the train station. But of course, by the time they got back together on the platform, the train was long gone. Somebody who worked at the train station said, I understand what's going on. Just wait here. There will be another train. You can get on that. And they did. So they were able to finally get out of Germany. But with only 2 suitcases and $10 total.
We don't know. We can't figure it out.
There's some
dad
talk
didn't
about
know.
how
He
they
didn't know.
anticipated getting it out and they shipped it ahead of time. But where it was shipped to, how it was paid for, who stored it, how did it get to America?
I do know with Jane, she had a who she called Frowley, which was kind of her nanny. And when they had to leave in the middle of the night and leave everything behind in Vienna and go to Prague, the nanny took all their stuff. She lived in the countryside. She packed everything up. And then once they had a permanent residence in New York, she then sent their stuff to them. So that was how their things were protected by this nanny who lived with them. But Al, we don't understand that.
I never got much of an answer.
When I think there's one thing when he used to speak, he spoke about a couple incidences where miracles happened. And one of them was the postcard that said, go give regards to Herbert, right?
Yep.
But one that we haven't yet touched on is an upstander that we highlight in our museum, Lottie Bachman. And I'm wondering if one of you, because really I think that Al was not there when this happened during Kristallnacht. And if not for this upstander, who knows what would have happened. I mean, Al's father most likely would have been arrested like other Jewish men and sent to a concentration camp. Can one of you share the story of Lottie Bachman and just how pivotal that moment was in their story?
Years later, she was a good non-Jewish friend of my grandparents, and she was very good friend of theirs. And they had to leave their apartment on Crystal Night, and they couldn't go back. It was too dangerous, and they had nowhere to go. This friend, Lottie Bachman, took them in for the night and said, here, you must come and stay with me. Terrible risk to herself, terrible danger, because if she was found or caught harboring Jews, she was on her way to the concentration camp the next day. But she, without a thought, without any concern for her own safety, she had them stay. And then comes the next day, she wanted them to stay longer. They wouldn't do it. They said, we cannot risk your safety. We'll figure something else out, which is when my grandfather went to the hospital, the Catholic hospital that took him in, and my grandmother actually did return to the apartment because she was a woman and it was not as quite dangerous then, and then had to scramble to get the paperwork. But Lottie Bachman is what we absolutely call an upstander, somebody who, without regard to their own personal safety or comfort, risked themselves to help others. Now, I met her years later in New York. I have only a vague memory of her, but my father always talked about what a tremendous typist she was. She could carry on a conversation here and talk to you and be typing something else entirely during that entire conversation. So she was a remarkable woman, and we are eternally grateful for what she did for our family.
And I think one of the things that's interesting based on the documents and all of the artifacts that you recently donated is that we found out it was Al's mother who came up with the idea for her husband to go into the hospital to have the surgeries.
Yeah. And also whoever this doctor may have been, he was an upstander too. I mean, he really understood their predicament without them really having to say it.
They were just talked in code.
Yeah.
Say, I need surgery.
Yeah.
Because in that writing, I believe she said he was very understanding of our situation.
Correct.
And I think that's amazing. He definitely knew, maybe advised him on what would be the less invasive types of unnecessary surgeries to have. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
Our family, my wife couldn't go because she had broken her foot, but Barbara and her wife, my brother Randy, and my brother Ronnie and his wife Tracy, and my parents all went back to Berlin 15 years ago, whatever, some years ago, and we went to that hospital. So my father's apartment, my father went back into the apartment because Barbara and Randy and I were somewhere else in Berlin visiting other parts of the city. And we went to the shirt factory, which of course is no longer a shirt factory, but we saw all the places.
What is it now today?
It's apartments.
Apartment.
Loft apartments.
And Barbara was saying how wonderful my father's apartment was. My father learned how to ride a bicycle by riding it in the dining room of his apartment.
Where they had a sit-down dinner for 80 people. So you can imagine.
And all of it gone.
That is actually one of the questions I have, because we know Al did go back to Germany as part of the U.S. military, part of Ritchie Boys and interrogation. Was that family trip the only other time that you returned to Germany? And
for us it was.
Okay.
But not for Al.
Are you aware of, were there any feelings of apprehension or anger or anything? Was it hard for Al to go back to Germany after so many years?
I think initially it was. The trip that we went on, there weren't any problems, but I have an interesting story from that trip.
Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
The reason we went, though, was because Al was asked to speak to high school students at the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And what we didn't know was that these students, by communicating with Al here, had created an exhibit to Al and his parents and to the shirt factory and the contributions that his family had made in Germany, and it was incredible.
Walking through the museum.
And he kept that secret from you, right? You didn't know until you got there and saw the exhibit.
I'm walking through the museum looking at the different artifacts. Not really a Holocaust museum, just the history of the Jews in Germany.
Contributions Jews made.
Yeah, and I'm walking, and all of a sudden, oh my God, there's my grandfather, and his picture was a picture I've seen a gazillion times on an old-fashioned phone, and other artifacts that I had grown up with. Here they are in a museum in Berlin. It knocked me over. It was incredible. During that trip, we had gone to the symphony. And we were Americans, and clearly we dress like Americans, we act like Americans, we talk English. And at intermission, we were just standing around among ourselves, talking to each other. And some man very well dressed with his wife or girlfriend, equally well dressed, comes up to us and says to my father in German, "Are you American?" Well, clearly we were American. That was a no-brainer. But then he asked my father, "Are you Jewish?" And my father was somewhat taken aback at that and didn't know the answer, what she said, but he said, "Yes, we are." And then the man said, "I want to apologize. I'm so sorry for what we did to you during the war." My father said, "Look, you weren't even born then. You have nothing to apologize for, so I appreciate it, but don't worry about it." My father didn't say, but he thought, Now, I don't want to ask what your parents did or your grandparents. I don't know. I'm not going to ask what level of complicity they may have had, but he let this man off the hook completely. But there was another encounter with them. I don't think I was there on a bus or on a tram where people, similar situation happened where people apologized to my parents who again let them off the hook. So the Germans, at least then, were certainly not whitewashing whatsoever what they did. And of course there were memorials and statues and artifacts all over Berlin, and I suppose other parts of Germany.
I do remember, though, on that trip, both parents, 2 different times, had a visceral reaction to anyone their age. I do remember that. And I remember being at breakfast, and a couple walked in wearing the country folk wear, I forget what it's called, the German...
The lederhosen?
Exactly. And my mother-in-law did not like that at all. I remember the 2 moments of that on that trip. So it was not about the younger generation, but in their generation, I remember them vividly stating that.
And how did he ever describe what it was like to go back to Germany so soon after the war? I mean, I know he was there on official military business, but did he ever share any experiences of how he was treated or received by Germans?
He was in the American section of Berlin because he was there as an American soldier. And what I do remember him saying, the only time he actually felt ashamed to wear the American uniform was when he saw Jews behind barbed wire in a DP camp. It really bothered him. And I guess they were in the American section. And I remember him saying that he thought that was terrible. And other than that, the other story that I vividly remember him saying was when he would tell a family, they were given orders, you can tell a family to leave their house, a German family, you give them, I think it was 3 days notice, let's say it was 2 or 3 days notice. And I remember him saying, I said, well, how'd you feel about that? You're evicting people from, he goes, well, we were only given, 10 minutes. I mean, so there was this right of taking over a house because these guys were stationed all over in Germany. And those are the 2 stories I remember him telling about going back.
I remember.
And that it was bombed badly. I mean, the Allies had really bombed Berlin.
But I do remember him sharing about his best friend Tasso and how special that relationship. Tasso the dog, as we see in the photo, and how sad he was that he couldn't bring him back.
Right.
After the military, what was Al's life like? Did he get right into that next chapter of his life?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
He went to college. He was in Oklahoma, and then he ended up in, like I said, the Northern Illinois College of Optometry, I think is what it was called. And became an optometrist. He had the background from lenses that he started at Bausch & Lomb in London. And then, like I said, he ended up moving to first Toledo, where I was born, and then to Hamilton.
Fred, when did you learn that he was a Ritchie boy? Was it when the book came out?
No, before that.
Okay.
It was maybe 10 years or so ago. He had a whole box that he gave me I borrowed, of all his reports. How he got these top secret reports out is beyond me. He had all these reports on all this interrogation and everything with his recommendation. Mm-hmm. I believe that he needs further interviews or let this one go. No, not a big deal. He had a whole box full of them that he talked about 10, 15 years ago when that's where I first learned about it.
That's when you learned about it.
But that's an interesting point. When in your life did you realize your parents were Holocaust survivors? I know you said they were always very open to speak about their experiences with you, but when did you make that connection?
I don't think there was a turning point. didn't know one time and didn't know another time. I grew up with it. I mean, I always knew we obviously were Jewish, and I knew my parents were German and Austrian, and they always talked about the Holocaust or having to escape Germany and Austria. It was never a secret. So there was never any one turning point where I learned it all of a sudden.
And I think it's interesting, too, because don't forget they lived in Hamilton, Ohio, but their parents lived in New York. So when you would go to New York and meet your grandparents and their friends, and they were all right.
Yeah, everybody what they called refugees.
Right.
The entire world. My grandparents on both sides, my paternal grandparents, one lived in Riverdale in the Bronx, and the other lived in Forest Hills in Queens. And all their friends and acquaintances and other relatives were all German Jews.
Well, in the final couple minutes that we have left, I'm curious how Al's experiences or even his mission later in life to educate about the Holocaust, how has that impacted both of you?
I'm sitting here now talking to spread my father's story to hopefully inspire other people and educate other people. This is far from over, and in fact, life is becoming worse daily, as we all know from the news. So I take it as my personal mission to propagate my father's story and to let people know what has happened and what could easily happen again.
And I also think both Fred and I are grandparents, which is a new chapter for us. And I think, yes, it's important to speak to schools and to students, but it's also within the family. I think, how do you impart from generation to generation what your family's heritage is, what their legacy is? What are the lessons to take away? What does it mean to speak up? What does it mean to be an upstander? What does it mean to be in this world and try to make it better? And I hope that one day my grandchildren inherit many of Al's qualities. I have 2 grandsons, and I would be thrilled to know that they can live up to his, which might be tough, but.
And that is a perfect segue to the last kind of question, but it's actually more of a statement that I hope you both can respond to. So when people hear my family story, I want them to remember, and can you fill in that sentence?
I want them to remember, like I said before, what has happened, and then it can happen again.
And I would agree 100%.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to speak about Al and also Janie and that legacy. And thank you both for the work you're both doing to keep that alive and keep Holocaust awareness in the forefront and teaching those lessons to others. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And
thank you for inviting
Trinity.
us.
Thank you for everything you're doing. Really great work.
To make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe to our channel on YouTube and let us know your thoughts on this episode in the comments, or you can email us. You can also connect with us on Instagram and TikTok at Holocaust and Humanity, and X and Facebook at CincyHHC. Links are in the show notes. Thanks for joining us. Hear My Story is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. This series is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling. Our gratitude to Margaret and Michael Valentine, whose transformative support makes this series possible. Visit us in person in historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online anytime at holocaustandhumanity.org. Executive producers are David Wise and Jackie Congedo. Managing producer is Ann Thompson. Consulting producer is Joyce Kamen. Technical producer is Ron Thomas, and technical director is Ethan Spagna. Additional editing by Tom Maynard. Videography and additional editing by Robert Mills. Emotions, opening theme music, is generously provided by Kick Lee. Recorded at Technical Consulting Partners Studios in Cincinnati, Ohio.